Okay, so a couple people were asking about the mechanics while I was streaming this, and it's a bit hard to explain in depth while actually playing, so I figured this might be a fun video format to try. Also, I'm going to apologise for the quality of the video here, since I forgot to save a local replay and had to get a rip from my own stream. Also, you can ignore the text in the top right corner since I forgot to remove it when we started making Savage attempts for the day. I was pretty tired at this point. It was day 3 after 2 very long days. So to reiterate, this is Aloalo Savage. This is not a normal practice session. In fact, let me just drop this here so there's no confusion. Anyway, Savage functionally plays out the same as regular Criterion, but with a few key differences. Everything has more health, the bosses and especially the trash rooms hit harder, and you've got to do the entire dungeon in one run with an overall enrage timer of about 24 minutes. If anyone dies at all over the course of the run, it's game over. You go back to the start. You have no chance to recover. Since the overall encounter length of these Savage Criterion dungeons is going to clock in at around 22 to 23 minutes, this makes it incredibly punishing. But anyway, let's get started. The trash rooms in this one are easier than the prior Criterion Savage dungeons, but the first room in this one is still nothing to sneeze at. I think unlike Sildi and Rock-On, the harder room is the first rather than the second. Kiwakin first. I'm using Recitation immediately because I want it up as soon as possible for the final enemy in this room. Another major difference in Savage compared to regular Criterion is that because you can't stop and wait or reset for cooldowns before bosses, your cooldown timing during the trash rooms is going to impact what's up for bosses and when. You need to keep this in mind because if you use anything particularly high investment at the end of a room, it's not going to be up at the start of a boss. Similarly, you may not want to blow anything high investment at the end of the first boss if you need it at the start of the second room. While you're fighting this first guy, a bunch of tornadoes will spawn around the edges of the arena and start tracing the perimeter clockwise. You need to avoid these while killing all the trash in this room, or they'll one-hit KO you. The locations are fixed, so you'll get a feel for the pacing. Kiwakin is going to dish out a couple hard-hitting tank busters. Warrior's high self-healing combined with Recitation Excog and Seraph is enough to largely take care of it. The second one also applies a bleed effect that needs to be cleansed. You need to kill it before the tail screw goes off, or at least I think you do. We saw it go off once and the chance of recovery seemed slim to non-existent. Second up is the crab group. These guys are nothing special. There's a stack marker that doesn't do a whole lot of damage after some light mitigation, but the big thing you need to remember while taking this is to avoid the tornado creeping around the corner. The big crab then casts Bubble Shower, which is a short-range front conal AoE and then will immediately follow up with Crab Dribble, which is a conal AoE towards its direct rear. If you can find the space to occupy its flanks, you'll be safe the entire time. Next up, the Ray. Shortly after you pull, it's going to aim towards a player and perform a line AoE. We're baiting it towards the west wall here, since there's a tornado coming towards it, and we'll be able to freely AoE behind the Ray while it's firing off the AoE. It will then immediately follow this up with a point blank AoE, so just get out of the way. It will then follow this one up with a donut AoE, so get in afterwards. Now for the last guy, the Monk. This guy is the only genuine asshole mob of the dungeon. He's going to apply this heavy damage over time dropsy debuff on everyone who isn't the tank, but he does it in a sequence, and the order is random. Also, this attack will knock back whoever it hits, but you can mitigate it with Surecast or Arm's Length. It's tricky to heal, but you'll eventually find something that works reliably. In my case, I drop Soil and use Whispering Dawn on the first. I also chuck Fey Union on the first target. The second player gets an Excog. Shortly after the third player gets hit, you start getting more value out of AoE heals. So this is when I use Fey Blessing, Indom, Succor, and switch the Union target to the third player. I'd get more value out of using Whispering Dawn later too, but I need it up early for the first boss. Also, this guy can get pretty sketchy if your group is slow, but we're not, so I'm not going to worry about it. As long as you keep people healthy before the second set, you should be okay. However, it's just really important I end this room with at least one Etherflow stack, since I need Sacred Soil for the first raid wide. And now we're up to the first boss. As you can see, there's no real waiting about. I get enough time to pre-shield, and then we pull immediately. This boss hits a little harder compared to the other two, so keep on top of your healing and mitigation. This boss is going to open up with a raid wide that applies a strong damage over time effect on the entire party. Even with Soil, Expedient, Illumination, and a Reprisal, this is ticking for 13.5k. And you want to make sure you keep everyone healthy by the time this stops ticking, because it's going to follow it up with another strong raid wide. Okay, now after this spring crystal cast, 4 crystals have spawned. Take note of their orientation. Essentially, we can think of 2 of them as facing vertically and 2 of them facing horizontally. They'll perform a line AoE in whichever direction they're facing. However, they're going to end up in completely different spots than they are now. So what I'm drawing here is just for demonstration purposes only. The party will also be inflicted with several debuffs. The yellow one is a snare that will root the player in place when the timer expires. The blue one, like the one I have now, traps the player inside a bubble like the crystals are right now. We'll also either get stack or spread markers. Okay, so the arena has split into 4 quadrants, each with either a 1 or a 2 marker, and we can see this kind of wind AoE that signifies a knockback direction. The quadrants marked with a 1 will get knocked back simultaneously into the 2 quadrants, and then the 2 quadrants will perform their knockbacks at the same time. Anyone, or anything encased in a bubble, is susceptible to this knockback, and they'll get knocked back exactly 2 squares. So what's going to happen is the crystals are going to get knocked around the arena in sequence and end up in different locations than they are now. You'll end up with 4 save spots, so players either need to occupy 4 squares individually for the spread debuff, or occupy 2 squares in pairs for the stack debuff. Since we got stack markers this time, players want to occupy the same starting quadrants with the aim that will end up stacked together in pairs. If you got the bubble debuff, this mechanic requires almost no thinking at all. Regardless if we get stack or spread, all you need to do is occupy the spot next to a vertically oriented crystal, and you'll always get knocked into a safe spot since you'll never end up not perpendicular to it. Crystals only ever line up vertically, so there's no risk of being dropped into an unsafe area. Yellow requires a little more thinking. It's a little hard to see here, but there's a vertical crystal on the very northeast corner, and a horizontal crystal under the boss. We can see that the northeastern crystal will get knocked above the northwestern crystal first, and then the pair of them will get knocked southwest, and explode like this. For the record, the middle tiles will never be safe. Let's watch this play out. A crit low was overkill for this, but yeah, the damage isn't too bad. I put up some light shielding for the next mechanic, in which a bunch of bubbles are going to spawn around the edges of the arena, and we're going to get spread and stack debuffs. One of these debuffs is going to have a shorter timer than the other, so it's either stack then spread, or spread then stack. I'm going to start on a tile that doesn't have a bubble occupying it, and then I'm going to shift behind the bubbles once they start moving, but stay within my quadrant. You've only got about 5 seconds to stack up with your partner after the spread debuff goes off, but we naturally beat up if we keep following our bubbles. The hitbox on these bubbles is a little wacky, so you never want to be occupying the space in front of them, but you can get behind them pretty tight. The next mechanic doesn't do a whole lot of damage, so as long as everyone's topped up, don't worry about it. It will also resolve during 2-minute burst. A bunch of line AoEs will occupy the arena in an alternating fashion while the boss either casts an in or an out AoE, and then immediately follows it up with the opposite. We also need to stack up in pairs at the end of this mechanic. It's pretty straightforward, but it resolves quickly, so you can't wait around. Once again, we've been afflicted with spread debuffs. You'll always get spreads here. The boss will then summon 4 untargetable adds. It will then spawn 4 of the same crystals from earlier. There's only a few configurations to these, and you will either get north-south, east-west, or corner safe spots. In our scenario, we have north-south safe spots. And once again, players get afflicted with either snare or bubble debuffs. Note that 2 of the adds have also been afflicted with bubbles. What's going to happen is that these adds are going to perform 180-degree cleaves towards the closest player, but everyone afflicted with a bubble is going to get launched into the air, including the adds. The objective is that the snared players bait the bubble adds, while the bubble players bait the other 2. The end result is that all the adds will end up aiming at thin air, since the bubble adds will be cleaving above the snared players, while the grounded adds will be cleaving underneath the bubbled players. To figure out who goes where, we have a priority system. Our priority order is tank, healer, magic DPS, and then physical DPS. Then, going clockwise from the 4 marker, we look at the ads. Since we need to be spread out to resolve the spread AoEs, our aim is to spread out in a fashion where we can quickly move clockwise into our respective ads. As you'll soon see, you have very little time to move after the spread AoEs have gone off. Now let's look at the ads. Starting from 4, we have nothing, bubble, bubble, nothing. The tank and I are both snared, but he takes priority over me. The east ad is the first one with a bubble, so he's taking that one, while I take the south one. And since I want to be moving clockwise into my ad, I'm occupying the safe southeastern tile. Now to watch everything explode. Pay attention to how quickly I get snared, it's barely more than a GCD. And you'll see this bubble ad I'm baiting gets launched into the air and misses me entirely. Easy peasy. I'm immediately prepping a crit low since the next mechanic comes in quick. The damage profile is pretty high, so I chuck a lot of resources into it. We've been afflicted with spread and stack markers again. The timers may be swapped around, so the order you do things may be different. The boss is also going to split the arena into east and west sides. We get knocked back, the stack resolves, and now we need to immediately spread. And I glare at my summoner who doesn't get into my soil, and is somehow so far away they dodged my Fey Blessing too. Good thing Etherflow just came off cooldown. For the record, the intersection soil reaches on the arena are all fine spots to stand with the spread debuff. You stand in exactly the same spots during the ad mechanic. Anyway, a bunch of spherical crystals, bubbles, and towers are going to spawn on either side of the arena. The spherical crystals will explode in a relatively small circle AoE. However, as you can see, there's only one tower on our side. One player needs to get inside a bubble and get blown to the other side, being careful that where they end up isn't occupied by a crystal. Some of the crystals are also in bubbles, so keep an eye out for those. You've got to wait for the crystals to explode, and then get inside your tower. At this point we've seen everything the boss has to offer. It'll repeat some mechanics before it enrages. Another raid wide is coming out soon, so I've got to get everyone healthy and toss some mitigation up. And now it's the same crystal bubble mechanic that we saw at the start of the fight. Since I was the bubble player last time, I'll be the snare player this time. Also, we'll have the spread debuff rather than the stack debuff this time, so we'll want to end up spread out. Since we know a vertical crystal is always going to occupy a 1 quadrant, I can preemptively move to a 2 and have way more time to think about this than you may think I have at first, due to the limitations on the crystal's orientation that I mentioned earlier. But yeah, same mechanic as earlier, so I don't need to elaborate on it. Though it was filtering me for a long time during prog, which was pretty embarrassing. Out of the 3 bosses in this dungeon, this was my least favourite of the lot. The other 2 were a lot more fun. Also, I don't know if they were going for this, but this guy seriously reminds me of the Windfish from Link's Awakening. Anyway, after that we have the same alternating line mechanic we saw before. The boss will cast in or out AoEs again, but the order will be reversed, relative to what it did the first time round. So this time we're stacking outside the boss rather than inside. And now you get one more bleeding AoE before the end rage, which we don't see. Maybe there was one more AoE after the bleeding AoE, but yeah, I don't know, I couldn't tell you. Alrighty, second trash room. Compared to the prior Criterion Savage dungeons, this second room is pretty easy, but I'd rather have it this way than another round of Rock On's second trash room. Just thinking about that room gives me conniptions. Anyway, this one's pretty similar to Sildi's, in the sense that it's a bit of a timing exercise with the patrolling mobs, but this time you have full visibility of the area. You'll notice the golems have this red sword visual effect on them, which gives them a damage buff, while the Isle Keepers have a blue shield effect, giving them a defense buff. But this defense buff makes them practically impervious. When you kill a mob, the buff they have swaps around, so killing a golem shifts the attack buff to the Isle Keepers, and the remaining golem will have a defense buff. This means the kill order is golem, Isle Keeper, golem, Isle Keeper. So we first pull this golem and take it all the way to the back of the arena. Now all the other mobs have started patrolling the room. This guy smacks pretty hard, but he's otherwise unremarkable. It will start casting an AoE shortly after you pull it that you'll need to silence, or it will immediately wipe you. Tornado is a small AoE that will bind a player, so whoever gets it has to move away from the group. It also does a decent chunk of damage in Savage. You then need to quickly cleanse the bind, since the golem will immediately follow it up with Ovation, which is a short-ranged line AoE. The range on this AoE is pretty short, so you can force the golem to walk up to you if you go far enough. For the Isle Keepers, I want to pre-shield for the raid wide it casts that applies a damage over time effect. I deploy Crit Low for the first one. I kinda screw up here and use all my stuff way too early. With proper timing, I'd be able to mitigate both the Ancient Quagga and the Gravity Force. But well, we kill it so quickly because we're using 2-minute burst here that it doesn't matter anyway. The damage over time effect is pretty meagre here too. I remember Sylde's second trash room being way more of a shock to the system in this regard. Compared to the prior 2 dungeons, this one didn't really keep me on my toes. Now for the next golem, same deal again. However, the remaining Isle Keeper will start patrolling around the room much faster than before. The patrol route is the same every single time, so you won't really have to look out for them once you have a consistent pace down. But yeah, there's not much else to elaborate on here. This room's fairly uneventful. Maybe it's just as well, because the amount of wipes you'll probably have in something like the second room of Rock-On is outright painful. But still, I think I would have preferred something that kept me on the edge of my seat even just a little bit. Now for the second Isle Keeper and the final mob of this room. This one's going to live longer, so we'll see another attack. You'll want to fight this guy somewhere near the exit just so you can save a little bit of time between killing it and pulling the next boss. Just Seraph on top of Soil this time to cover the damage over time damage. I guess we did also have a Reprisal and a Dismantle up on this as well, but still, I wish it just hit just a teeny bit harder. After the stack marker, stay stacked up until it casts Isle Drop. This attack simply aims a small AoE at someone random the moment it casts. So as long as you move away during the cast bar, it's fine. And that's it for this room, it's pretty chilled out. Now for the second boss, we all found this dude pretty fun, and progging him can only be described as physical comedy. If you're proactive and save your markers from a previous attempt, you can quickly set them on another, but we had to pause for a second to quickly rejig them, since we made some changes while practicing in normal mode. He's going to start off with a raid wide that does pretty moderate damage, but overall is non-threatening if you just follow the standard procedure. There's no damage over time effect to worry about or anything, and he'll cast it a number of times over the course of the fight. We're then immediately introduced to this boss's primary mechanic. He's going to give himself a buff that assigns either a 3 or a 5 and start telegraphing a cleave. The cleave is 270 degrees and will leave one of his sides open. However, he's also telegraphing an anti-clockwise rotation. The 3 or 5 buff signifies how many rotations the AoE will perform. This number is only ever a 3 or a 5, but the open side can start from any cardinal direction. So, since the boss is currently a 5 and the open side is facing towards C, you do 5 rotations anti-clockwise and the open side will end up on B. However, we had a shorthand for this. Essentially, you can think as 5 as simply +1 and 3 as -1 in the respective direction. In this scenario, since the boss is a 5, we can simply just do 1 rotation clockwise and it ends up on C again. If he had a 3, you'd go 1 in the opposite direction and end up on D. He'll do this several times across the encounter and it's a 1-hit KO in Savage if you screw it up, so pay attention. Next up is Arcane Array. I chuck up Crit Adlo and dump plenty of mitigation up for this as a contingency measure more than anything else. Screwing up during this mechanic can be easy, but it won't immediately kill you. But it will deal more damage and give you a damage down, which isn't ideal either. The only thing you absolutely need to get right is the Arcane Blight that's cast during the middle of it, which is the mechanic we just saw earlier. A bunch of crap is going to spawn around the arena. These arrows on top of the lit square panel signify the direction the square will get lit up. When they connect with another arrow, they'll change to their respective direction. You're going to end up with one safe row or column running down the middle. There's also 2 orbs that appear. One of these is right next to an arrow tile and will explode almost immediately, while the other is primed to detonate later on and will appear on the opposite side. It's somewhere off screen right now, but it'll be somewhere down here. Now, if you've done Orbon Monastery, this 3/4 circle around my character will look familiar. The aim is to keep the open side towards the orbs and then towards the boss at the end of the mechanic. Since the orb towards 4 is going to detonate first and my rear is the open side, I need to make sure my ass is facing it. If you're playing on legacy controls like me, having strafe binds is really useful here since it'll make keeping track of your rotation easy. Right after the first orb detonates, he does the same mechanic we saw at the start of the fight. Again, if you screw this up, you die and your run is over. The open side is B, and he's doing an anti-clockwise rotation while being buffed with a 3. So we're going to do one rotation in the opposite direction, clockwise, and sit on C. Shortly after that, the second orb pops. Remember to keep your open side towards it. And then last up, he's going to shoot everyone while making their open side spin. You resolve it in exactly the same way you'd figure out the boss's cleave direction during Arcane Blight. So you want to make sure your open side is facing the correct direction before it's rotated to face the boss. I'm a 3 anti-clockwise, so I want to face my open side towards the left. It will then rotate 3 anti-clockwise and face towards the boss. The great thing about playing Barrier Healer is that you can play it safe during these kinds of mechanics while still maintaining uptime, since Art of War and Discrasia are point-blank AoEs around you. After the mechanics resolved, we'll get a Tank Buster. These are pretty respectable in Savage, so keep an eye out. And nobody got a damage down while resolving the previous mechanics, so the run's looking pretty good so far. Next up is Planar Tactics. We'll all get marked with these fire debuffs with values ranging from 1 to 3. One player will have a 1, 2 players will have a 2, and 1 player will have a 3. The AoEs are going to leave puddles on the floor, and we want to soak up the same number of puddles as the number on our respective debuffs. To complicate things, we have a Force March with either a 3 or a 5 rotation debuff again, and we have to stack up in pairs at the end. So we line up around the AoEs depending on the number on our debuff, like so. The 3 is away from the party and will soak up the entire bottom row, while the 1 and the 2 players marked with 2 line up on the same side. Also, the outside 2 player may want to stand a little further back to ensure they don't beat the 3 player to the third puddle. If you want to double check your rotation here, you can physically rotate your character the respective number of times in the opposite direction. It's better to play it safe, because wiping in Criterion Savage is definitely in the list of the top 5 most miserable things you can do in this game. Right after the mechanic resolves, there's a raid wide. You need to be quick on the mark for it. And then, that's followed up by a Tank Buster. I'm just respecting these in Savage and making sure to X-Cog our tank, since I'm still not entirely sure how hard they hit. There's no pre-shielding necessary though. And then after a short reprieve, we'll be on to our next mechanic, Spatial Tactics. This guy always takes a few steps to wind up what he's doing. We'll get there eventually. Tiles with arrows on them are going to appear on the opposite corners from each other, and again, you'll end up with one safe row or column. A bunch of cubes have also appeared that will detonate in a Bomberman-esque plus shape when the tile they're on lights up. An orb has also appeared right next to the starting arrow tile. In fact, let me just get rid of this for the sake of visibility. Again, players are marked with a debuff value, though this time they range from 1 to 4. But there's a bit of a trick to this. The orb that detonates is going to cleanse a stack off everyone, so the true values are more like 0 to 3. But I'm going to explain the mechanic using the full values. Whenever you're hit with a cube's AoE, you remove one stack. If anyone fails to remove all their stacks, you wipe. The cubes always spawn in the same pattern, so you want to orient yourself relative to the orb. The one player has to avoid every cube's explosion. It's worth noting the snapshot on these is super early. As one, you can sit in the middle until this cube detonates, and then move out and stay there. The 2 player can simply sit in the middle, and they'll get hit by this cube. The 3 player wants to occupy the first square away from the boss, opposite where the orb spawned, and can simply stay there. They'll get hit by these 2 cubes. The 4 player can also sit where the 3 player is. However, after being hit by the second cube, they want to move back 1 tile and get hit by the last cube. Right after all this, the boss is going to cast another Arcane Blight, and rotate another cleave like we've seen earlier. You'll resolve this in exactly the same way. Just keep in mind that if you had the 4 debuff, you may be required to run all the way through the boss, so don't dawdle. The damage on this snapshot is as soon as the Arcane Blight cast bar finishes. He'll cast another raid wide, and do another shortly after too. Soil can cover both. The damage is respectable, but it's not too scary. The first boss was definitely much more demanding to heal, while the third boss is pretty laid back in terms of damage output. Anyway, he'll then follow up these AoEs with the last mechanic you'll have to learn before he repeats stuff. This time, adds are going to spawn somewhere along the edge of one side of the arena. We'll treat this side as our new north position. Some arrow markers will also appear on the floor again. The adds are going to fire line AoEs down the arena, and again, the arrows will then light up the respective direction they're facing. You'll end up with one safe row at the top, and then two safe areas roughly in the middle, with enough space for players to occupy one tile each. Since we treat the side that adds spawn as north, I occupy the east side with the summoner, while the west side is occupied by the tank and the machinist. And we start off standing in whichever column an add isn't occupying. The players will then also get an overhead marker and light up whichever tile they're currently on. We then want to shift into the far corners of the remaining safe areas. We'll then each drop large AoEs in these corners, and leave enough space to stack up in pairs. The damage output going through all this is pretty respectable, so you want some sort of plan going through it. The boss will then follow this up with another tank buster, and then a raid wide. I just take care of this like usual. And then after this, the boss will simply repeat the mechanics we saw at the start of the fight. I make the same contingencies this time too. This time, my open side is on my right flank. The first orb has spawned at 4. If I strafe around the boss, it's easy to keep track of my open side's direction. Again, if you don't do this part properly, you'll die. Now I show my open side to the second orb, and then make sure I'm rotated properly to have my open side end up on the boss. I'm 5 clockwise, so I want to turn around and make sure my open side points towards my left. Our tank fails at this time, but as you can see, it's not fatal. And after that you've got another tank buster and a raid wide or two, but we kill the boss before we see those. Pretty fun boss, and I enjoyed it a lot more than the first one. And now it's time for the third and final boss. It may have been possible to wait for 2-minute cooldowns to come up before pulling, but the enrage timer was looking a little sketchy, and since we hadn't seen the entirety of the third boss in Savage at this point, we weren't entirely familiar with how much HP she has, nor what sort of kill time we were expecting. Your own mileage might vary here. Like usual, she's going to open up with a raid wide. The damage is pretty respectable, but not particularly threatening with the usual stuff up. And then after that raid wide, we're introduced to the boss's first major mechanic, Trick Reload. She's going to load 8 bullets, but 2 of these are going to be duds. The first bullet she loads designates that she's going to perform either a spread or a stack AoE next. It's a coin toss whether she fails the first or not. In our case, the first bullet was a dud, so we have to stack. Later on, she's going to perform 6 simultaneous conal AoEs, and each of these are going to be marked with a number. So the next 6 bullets she loads designates which slice will be empty. She will always load a dud across one of these 6 bullets, but it's going to be random, so pay attention. In our case, the dud bullet was 4th. Whether the last bullet is a dud or not depends on what the first one was. It's always going to be opposite, since she'll always load 2 duds across the entire loading sequence. Since the first bullet was a dud, we know she'll load the 8th bullet, and we'll need to spread out later on. So in this clear, we know our sequence of events is stack first, 4th slice is free, and then we need to spread out later. The damage is pretty light here. Just keep people healthy for the second set of stack or spread damage. After our numbered slices have gone off, a bunch of bombs will spawn around the arena. They will appear in one of 2 possible configurations. Either as 2 triangles, like now, or in a star shape. Regardless of which pattern we get, we want to refer to the point as north. One of the bombs will be flashing orange. It, and every other bomb it's tethered to, will explode in a moderately sized AoE. So as we can see here, the entire relative south side is unsafe. And remember, we need to spread out here, since she loaded the 8th bullet from way back. The spread damage feels a little nastier than the stack, so you might want to chuck up extra for it. And then there's a fair bit of time before the next mechanic comes out. Okay, here's another trick reload, and we're going to have to stack first, then number 3 is safe, And since the first was a dud, we know we're spreading for the last trap shooting. The 3 in the spread won't be relevant until way later, so keep them in mind. Once again, bombs will appear. We got the star pattern this time. In this scenario, the north point would be between D and 4. She's going to turn the arena into a dartboard and start rotating the bombs. Keep an eye on the flashing one and remember which ones it was tethered to. The bombs will make 3 rotations. 3 players have also been marked with a dart debuff. When these debuffs expire, they'll detonate the colour the respective player is standing on. You want each dart player to occupy a different colour each, while the player without a debuff can stand on whichever colour they want. We got really good RNG here since the dud bullet was loaded first and the bombs will leave the middle safe. So we can just stack up in the middle of the arena on separate colours and wait things out. I deploy here regardless since the damage can get spicy if we're forced to spread. Depending how things play out, you may be forced to spread through the middle of the arena, spread around the edges, or stack up near the edge instead. Next up is Surprise Balloon. She's going to spawn 2 massive balloons on her flanks with her face plastered on them, which will detonate and cause knockbacks. At the end of this beguiling glitter cast, you can pop Surecast and Arm's Length. This will cancel the first balloon's knockback. Oh, remember that trick reloading from way back? Yeah, it's relevant now. We're on 3 by the way. Also be careful of the very narrow line AoE darting across the arena, since it deals some moderate damage. After the conal AoEs go off, you'll get knocked back from the second balloon. Just don't get knocked back into the wall. And now that last bullet is relevant. We just had a forced march here, so we either needed to spread out or stack up depending on whichever the last bullet was. If it was a stack, we'd all aim towards A. But since it was spread this time, we all went to designated markers. This is then followed up by a raid wide. There's plenty of time to chuck up stuff for it. The only time you need to be particularly attentive about the damage profile during this fight would be, let's say, during the spread on the dartboards, but that's it, really. We're now thrown into a downtime mechanic, so we can't target the boss right now. Once again, bombs have spawned. I locate the north point of this star pattern. These staffs that perform donut AoEs have also appeared. 2 players have been tethered to hands, while 2 other players have been tethered to missiles that have spawned on the edge of the arena. You're going to get chased by anything you're tethered to, and if it catches up, you'll die. The hand players will need to navigate towards a safe spot together to resolve a 2-player enumeration stack, while the missile players will need to run to a safe spot on the opposite side their missiles spawned, and simultaneously break a chain by running as far away from each other as possible once it's applied to them. The missile players will also have huge AoEs hovering over them, that everyone besides the target will need to avoid. The way we solve this varies slightly depending on how the bombs are oriented. The star pattern has a habit of making one of the relative east and west spots obscenely tight. So we have the missile players run north and south, while the hand players run to whichever east and west side has the most room to work with. If we get a double triangle pattern, the missile players instead run east and west, while the hand players can stack north. If you're a hand player, you'll want to run a lap around your hand before dragging it to where you want to go. I misread my tether here and almost wiped us. Thankfully, I stacked up in the middle in time with my chain partner before the debuff was applied. This chain is really unforgiving, and if you aren't sitting directly on top of each other, you'll probably fail to break it. And while I'm here, let me point out what I was saying about the east spot just earlier. There is a slither of space here, but it's pretty unreasonable, and the wall is actually closer than it looks. So we came up with this method to make it reliable every time. After the downtime mechanic has resolved, it's immediately followed up with a tank buster before we head into our second dartboard mechanic. This one's going to incorporate elements we just saw during the downtime mechanic. Okay, there's a lot of shit going on. This time, only 2 players have the dart debuff, while 1 colour is already marked as unsafe by this orb over here. These 2 debuffed players can sit in whichever colour the orb isn't hovering over, but we're still going to end up with a result in which all the colours will detonate. In this scenario, the dart debuff players want to sit on blue and red. We've also got rotating line AoEs that will either spin clockwise or anti-clockwise. They spin pretty slowly, but they'll creep up to you at the end if you aren't paying attention. Shortly, we'll get a 2-player enumeration, and 2 players will get chained again. Okay, so looking at the dart, we know yellow is already taken, and players can take blue and red. We're looking for a line AoE overlapping a blue-red pair on the edge of the arena. This will now be our north position. The enumeration wants to occupy this north position and will ideally sit in whichever colour the AoEs are rotating away from, in this case, red. The chain players will then run directly east and west. Since the chain will always be one support and one DPS, we set it up that the DPS always run east, while supports run west. I'm a chain here, so I'm running directly to the west. The DPS player running east here needs to be careful not to get ran over by the line AoE. I'm going to run straight to blue, while the enumeration dart player sits on red. Now, this is why I say the enumeration should ideally occupy the colour the AoEs are rotating away from. Because in this scenario, the tether players will have more space to work with sitting in the blue, rather than sitting in the red, which the line AoEs are already spinning over. There's going to be very rare instances where both chain players have the dart debuff, and in that case, you're going to need to communicate and be quick, because as soon as everything resolves, you must keep rotating to avoid the line AoEs. Don't forget it. This is then followed up by a raid wide. Just make sure everyone's healthy. The next mechanic takes some time to come out, so it's a good time to use the limit break. The incoming sequence of events doesn't have anything new, but it's the last thing you'll have to learn before Enrage. We get some pretty long forced march debuffs, and then she's going to follow this up with a trick reload. This time we are... stack first, and then 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 is safe, and we'll need to spread at the end. I'm playing it super safe here and making sure to shield and mitigate whenever I can. After the first stacker spread, the staffs will appear. Like before, they'll perform donut AoEs. These will cover over a significant portion of the numbered safe zone. The first pair of forced marches will resolve here, and we'll need to move into position to walk into the safe area. There's a little time to adjust afterwards, but you don't want to end up within the staff AoEs. The later pair of forced marches will resolve during the next spread or stack. In our case, we need to spread. Now pay attention to the bombs. We want to occupy the entire relative south region. Since the first forced march pair can move freely here, they can accommodate the second pair and move away from whichever direction they're running towards. If we had to stack here instead, we'd call out a marker to run towards. There's a couple more raid wides before it enrages here, but we kill it before then. God, it's fine, it's dead. Easy, fucking... Finally! Yes!
That was very clean. That was first pull.
These Savage Criterion dungeons are pretty grueling, but I enjoy doing them all the same. And hey, at least the rewards don't suck this time. For the record, I traded my token in for the warrior axe. I think the most important thing to do while progging this is to make sure you completely iron out the mechanics in normal mode, and don't chance anything on getting a bad pattern you don't understand. Get some ironclad strats that you know work 100% of the time, or you're going to have a bad time. While there's plenty of guide videos for 14, there's not much in the way of player commentary, and I figured presenting the fights like this might make it more engaging for the kind of person who might never touch this kind of content to begin with. And well, I personally have a distaste for guides that don't show footage. So hopefully you enjoyed this video. I've got an Omega Protocol video in the oven I've been working on that's in a similar vein, but way more elaborate than this, and it's become a bit of a personal white whale for me to finish up. So hopefully by the end of the year, maybe. Anyway, thanks for watching and take care. Special thanks to channel members Electrofunk, Aristhel, Bavi, and Pink Warlock. Your support is hugely appreciated. Thank you.